Hello, everyone, and apologies for our technical issues in getting this meeting started. I am Carrie Hamilton, and I'm a board member of the Type Directors Club, and I would like to welcome everyone to our virtual salon with Ross MacDonald. Before we get started, I would just like to take a moment on behalf of the TDC to pay our respects to George Floyd, whose funeral took place in his home city of Houston today and who will be laid to rest beside his mother. Mr. Floyd leaves behind a large and loving family that includes a 6-year-old daughter. We wish them peace. While we navigate through this time of necessary change, we wish to honor our commitment to provide education and resources to designers who need and want them. We hope that you enjoy Ross's talk today and that it inspires you to keep making, thinking, and acting. Now we would like to begin with a couple of announcements, which Paul Carlos will be giving us.
Hi, I'm Paul Carlos, President of TDC. Welcome to today's event. Help us grow our typographic community and become a TDC member. Make events like this and recordings of these events possible. And you can go to tdc.org to become a member. Also, if you want to contribute to TDC scholarships, we promote excellence in typography by giving to the next generation of students. Again, you can go to our website for more information. Without further ado, welcome, Ross.
Hi, thank you. Thank you. I'm here in sunny, sweltering Connecticut. I'm going to try to turn my camera around. There we go. Did that work? No, it didn't. There. That's my studio. It looks a little like where a serial killer might drag his next victim, but in fact, here's my studio. And the downstairs is given over entirely to letterpress. There's the Vandercook SP20, which is a flatbed cylinder repro press. This particular model was made to proof an entire page of a newspaper at one time, so it's got a large bed. 20 inches by roughly 28 inches. Flatbed cylinder. Doesn't get any better. Big paper cutter. Lots of piles of junk. Lots of type. But I wanted to show you, I've got a lot of cabinets of wood type, and you can see each cabinet is identified on the front to make it easier to find. Just gonna let my assistant in. Now wood type, most wood type that you see was manufactured by a process that involves a vertical router carving the letters out, and then to finish them, an engraver would go in and cut these really tight areas here, because the vertical router is just a spinning blade. And I'm showing you this type in particular because you can really see the tool marks. You can see where the router has gone deeper in some spots. And that's because this particular type was made by the guy who invented the router for making wood type, a guy called Darius Wells in New York City. Made his first wood type in 1825, and this is some of his early wood type. And it's still functional. All wood type is carved on the end grain. I don't know if you can see, but you can see the grain of the wood travels that way. So it's very sturdy, because when you're printing it, you're putting a lot of pressure on it, but you're pushing down on the wood grain, and wood is very strong in that direction. So this type, it's possible that it has been used for, virtually millions of impressions, but it's still completely printable. And you can see some of the letters have even broken and been glued back together. and they're still fine. They print just fine. Whereas older lead type, because lead is a soft metal, the older lead type generally gets worn down. Chip, what's wrong? Now, before Darius Wells invented the vertical router for cutting type, and by the way, the technology spread incredibly rapidly. There were, dozens of wood type manufactories all over America in, the 5 or 6 years after he started producing type in New York City. But before then, there was a lot of call for large display type. And what people did was they hand cut type. So you can see this type is all hand cut. You can see the tool marks right there. And this type is not cut out of end grain. It's cut out of side grain beechwood. This particular type was made in London. Now, because of the style of letter, it's what they called an antique back in those days. And that particular style dates to around 1815. I think Figgins, the foundry, was the first antique font. So that gives us an approximate date for this type. Somewhere between 1815 and 1825. And you can see that the letters are very uniform, even though it's hand cut. You can see those 3 R's are pretty much identical. So it's not hacked out, as a kind of, quick solution to a problem. It's actually manufactured by a skilled craftsman. And here's another example here. So this again is an antique dated to around the same time, because it too is hand cut. You can see the tool marks there. And again, this decorative style of antique, anytime they did anything like a drop shadow or inline or anything like that, the general term they would use is decorated. And this decorated style of antique dates from a little bit later, not much later. But again, it's probably manufactured somewhere between 1815 and 1825, somewhere in that 10-year period. These older fonts have no identification on them, no maker's mark, anything like that. They didn't really start doing that on type till around the 1850s. And I can show you what that looks like. They would typically put a maker's mark on the cap A. Sorry, this one doesn't have a maker's mark. What do you know? Okay. This font here was manufactured here in Connecticut in the 1850s by a great type designer called William Page. Some of these have his mark on them. There we go. I don't know if you can see that. William Page, Greenville, Connecticut. He started manufacturing wood type in 1854. And this particular font, although it's very common, you see it everywhere, this was actually designed by William Page. He designed a lot of the wood type fonts. William Page is the guy, before he came along, type designers just designed each font on its own. They just came up with an idea. They wanted a fat antique, or they wanted a skinny antique, and they just designed it from scratch. William Page was the guy who came up with the idea of taking a sort of a normal antique like this and stretching it sideways, what they called extended, like that, same font, just extended sideways, and then the same font again, made narrower. So the whole idea of type families didn't really exist at all. And he said, well, you know, Antique is a great font. Let's make a couple of extended versions and a couple of narrow versions. And this font would have been called Triple Extra Extended or 3X Extended Antique. And again, this is by William Page, right around that same time, 1854. And here is a smaller version. And I wanted to show you this version for a couple of reasons. One is that this shows you what printers used to have to do. There's a lot of little notes like this in all of my type cases, A on the back of N, because if a printer ran out of a letter, they typically bought fonts. Now, font is actually a unit of measurement for type. It is not, it has become the name for a synonym for typeface, but originally font was a unit of measurement. When you bought a bunch of type, you bought it by the font. And typically a font for a display face would be a 3A or 4A font. This is a 4A font, which means it has 4 A's, 3 B's, 3 C's, 3 D's, 4 E's, etc. Typically, these larger fonts would be 3A fonts, a little bit smaller. So you can really only set a couple of words. But in this 4A font, the printer still ran out of A's. He needed to make another one, or he needed another one. And his only option was to carve one. So you see, there's the original N, and he carved new A on the back. Now, that's fairly skilled. It looks good. I mean, I could put that in with a line of type and you wouldn't know that it was hand carved by the printer. Now, again, this is really hard wood. This is hard end grain maple, first growth maple. So it's got a really tight grain. It's hard as rock. But here's another thing that they did. In fact, I believe this originally was a 4A font, but at some point, one of the A's went missing. And the printer, when he needed an extra one, another solution he came up with is he took a V and he put a little piece of lead in there for the crossbar of the A. So this was the kind of thing that they would do because, you know, they were on a tight deadline trying to produce a poster for something and they just needed a letter and they would spend a couple hours carving one. Here's another not very successful attempt to make a B into an R. It's pretty rough. It might have worked in context, but it doesn't look very good. And it makes the B useless. So this has reduced the number of B's to 2. Now you could fill that back in and use it. But that's some of what they used to have to do. And here's an example of what kerning is originally. You actually cut away part of the original letter so that you can see the A and the T fit together better because they've been cut into. So, I have one more hand-cut font I want to show you. This one's a little bit of a mystery because this style of type, whoops, wrong one, sorry. That's the William Page font. There it is. This style of type, I don't think, predates the vertical router. So it's a little bit of a mystery why, you know, when type was very available, why you would go to all the trouble of hand carving this, unless it's some kind of weird aberration and somebody came up with this type style before it became produced commercially by a foundry or a wood type place. But again, you can see the letters are all pretty much identical. Look at the S's there, and look at the R's. They're pretty much identical, but it's all hand cut. So somebody went to a lot of trouble to produce this font. Now printers, you know, this kind of type was very precious, and they would use it over and over and over. They invested a lot of money in it, and so they wanted to keep using it as much as possible. And here are a bunch of really small wood type fonts. And this sort of begs the question of why would somebody go to all the trouble of cutting these? Because of the size, it would be very hard to cut this out with a router. Most of this would have been, you know, hand cut in some way or another. They would have cut out the general shape of the letters with a router, but beyond that, someone would have to go in and cut all the sharp counters everywhere. And you see it again with this font, which is even more elaborate and would have involved a lot of hand cutting. And it's kind of odd because these fonts were both available as lead type, which would have been, you know, much easier to make, to manufacture. This is again that extended antique by William Page, and I believe this is actually a page cutting. Then you have a couple of decorative fonts. That's a wood type font that was called Armenian because Armenians were apparently famous for their elaborate mustaches. So the typeface looks like it has elaborate mustaches, I guess. This is a typeface called Belgian, a very small decorated French Clarendon. But again, you know, why wood when you could make that much more easily with lead? Now this is an interesting font. This is William Page. So William Page actually invented a style of manufacturing wood type that did not use a router. It used steam press to push dies into the type. So the letters are actually cut out by pressing a steam press die into the wood and then pushing down the area that they'd cut out, again with a steam press. And he designed a whole series of fonts that were compatible with that style of manufacturing. And this particular font is, you know, very similar to a lot of the type that's really popular now. This kind of, it almost looks like a sans serif, but it's got tiny little angled serifs on it. And there's the lowercase of it too. And here we have some decorative stuff. One of the tricks you learn when you work in a letterpress shop is always pull the case, the drawer below out to support the one above. The only way to learn that is by dropping a few type cases. So these particular things would be used in posters to sort of point out an important line, you know, as if you couldn't do that typographically. You know, it's like, hey, everybody, this particular line is really important, so I'm pointing at it. You should read this first. You can see these are all different types and sizes. And they're kerned or cut out like that to fit in what's called a form, you know, fit in the form on the bed of the press. So you could have other letters or decorative elements coming right up next to it. And they made them all the way down to fairly small sizes in wood. And then if you need anything smaller, they manufactured plenty of lead type versions of it. Here's the real big one here. These, I believe that's Hamilton. I don't see manufacturer's mark, but I know I've seen it in the Hamilton catalog. And you can see someone cut that out, someone kerned it out on a circular saw, table saw. And then there are, you know, various borders and other decorative elements. All this stuff comes in really handy for doing posters. These are a couple of decorative things that I cut. You can see it's cut from a smashed old piece of type. And I attempted to engrave these words into the end grain. And let me tell you, after doing it a couple of times, I did not repeat the experiment. It is incredibly hard. And you can see these are some of the real ones. So again, you know, what they would use these for, partly it was decorative, and partly letterpress printers usually design on the bed of the press. So you get some copy and you start throwing type on the bed of the press, and what can happen is a line might be too long. Otherwise it's perfect, but it might not fit the length that you've decided to do. So you have various options that you can do to make it fit. And one of them would be using one of those pre-cut words to substitute for type in the hopes that it would take up less space. This decorative border here, this is again a Page design, William Page design, and it is made again using that method of pressing down on the wood. So you could get much more elaborate designs without having to go in and do a lot of hand engraving. If this design had been done with a router, it would have been almost entirely hand cut. They might have been able to cut out some of the larger lines with the router, but everything else would have been hand cut. Whereas with William Page, he just made one die, and then he could stamp these things out over and over again. You can see some of the really elaborate designs that he was able to produce with that method. So this would have been done, I believe, in the 1870s, more of his elaborate orders. And about 10 years later, I think 1885 or so, William Page sold all of his remaining inventory to Hamilton. Hamilton bought him out, bought everybody out. I gotta let Chip out, sorry. That's my other job here. This is a typeface that's called Bulletin. And you can see it's a back slanting italic. And it's actually a copy of a style of lettering, hand lettering. And the reason it's called Bulletin, it was really popular with newspaper vendors. Now, vendors would have little kiosks on the street, and they would have a large blackboard. And on that blackboard with white paint, they would hand letter the headlines every morning, and you know, they might change them in the middle of the day. And they developed a style of lettering with a really fat brush that looked exactly like this. It was also used to label crates for shipping. And in fact, some of these typecases have the original shipping destination hand lettered on the back in this style of lettering. So that was, you know, just one of many examples of type foundries or wood type manufactories responding to, you know, popular things that were going on in terms of design. And again, this is another example of the William Page thing of doing the triple extra condensed version, the double extra condensed version, and there's just a condensed version of pretty much the same font. This particular one is a newspaper headline font that is kind of, you know, has a clunky design. There's no, you can see it with the G's there. There's no information on who made it. There's no maker's mark or anything. Now, one of the typefaces that people think of when they think of wood type is this. This is really, really common. You know, when I was buying a lot of wood type, this was the most common face that you would find next to just regular sans serif. And this is called French Clarendon. And it's a Clarendon because the strokes of the letters meet the serifs with a curve. And when there's another almost identical version of that. You can see it here. See, it looks pretty much the same, but where the strokes meet the serif, it is an angle. It's a hard angle. So that's French. That makes it French antique. An antique is what we would call a slab serif now. They used to call it antique. And this very similar face, can't get it out, it's swollen, is a French clarendon because the strokes meet the serif with a slight curve. So, you know, that was kind of the terminology. Now they called a lot of faces names that had really nothing to do with the design. For instance, antique. Why call a slab serif an antique? Well, it was because there was real fascination around that time, around 1815, with ancient Egypt and ancient Greece. And so they tended to name typefaces and even entire type families after things that were sort of in the popular culture. So another name for an antique is Egyptian. And that's just because people were fascinated with ancient Egypt all of a sudden, because Napoleon's army was there and they were digging up mummies and they were making all kinds of discoveries also. And then another typeface name that you see is this one here, which is called Grecian. Again, nothing to do with the actual face. It's just because ancient Greece was suddenly more popular. Now, there's a weird quirk about this face. The earliest version of it has very fat serifs on the E and the F. So you know from looking at this one that it dates to 1845. And I don't believe there's a maker's mark on this, but let's just see. Yeah, I'm not seeing anything. So this is a very early version. You can see there's a couple more Grecian fonts here too. They have this sort of chamfered thing going on. The corners are cut off at an angle. That's what identifies it as a Grecian font. But again, you can see it's got these ginormous slab serifs on some of the letters. Now, literally just a couple of years later, they refined the design and they made those serifs smaller. So with no other identification, you can date some of the stuff just by what the font looks like. Some of the characteristics of it give you a very close idea of the date. This looks so much better. Like they realized, I think it's when you see something printed, you realize this is kind of ungainly, it's a little bit ugly. So they refined the design to produce something that was a little easier on the eyes. And this particular font here is another example of what can occur in a print shop. They bought a new version of Grecian and it was the same size as the old version, so they just mixed them together. So you can see the serifs are kind of all the same over here roughly, and then this one's a little bit narrower, and then you especially see it with the Fs. You see some of the original Fs with the big serifs, and then here's an F with the smaller serif. They're not really, they don't look similar when you set them in a line. You can see this F is much wider than that F, but the printer, as far as he was concerned, it was the same font, so they just used it like that. Now, another thing I wanted to show you. Oh, geez. Sorry, I don't remember which one it is. This font might be it. Yes, there it is. So that's an engraving. This comes out of a newspaper in Peru, Indiana, this type. And Peru, Indiana is a circus town. And the newspaper started in 1845, which predates this particular type, which is about 1855. The printer wanted to do a news story about an oil well, or something related to an oil well. They didn't have any kind of image, so somebody carved an illustration. There's a gas flare and there's an oil well there. In the back of a wood type letter, and just use that as an illustration. I used to have a proof of that hanging up, but I see it's gone. So I don't know what happened to that, but you can't really see it that well, but it actually prints quite well. You can see there are some figures down here sort of looking at the oil well. So, you know, that's letterpress printing in a nutshell. Printers designing stuff on the bed of the press, doing what fits, and just making stuff up as they went along. You know, that was most design in America in the middle of the 19th century. I also wanted to show you some more examples, if I can find it. Okay, so here's another one. These fonts are old. They probably date to around 1830. You can tell just from the style of letter. Now, this is what's called a fat face modern. It's basically based on Bodoni, you know, the modern thing of vertical stress, serifs at hard right angles to everything. None of the, you know, slanted stress that you would see in an old style face. It's very vertical and upright. And then everything is just broadened. It's a wood type variation on a font that was called Thorogood, which was one of the first fat face moderns from the very late 18th century, early 19th century. And this particular font is interesting because it has a mix of hand cut and machine cut letters that are virtually identical. And the other odd thing about this face is it's an unusual size. It is 11 picas. So it's 11 line, and that was, you never see 11 line type. It's always, it goes usually 4 line, 6 line, 8 line, 10 line, 12 line, 15 line, and like that. 11 line is really unusual. The other odd thing is, when I bought this font, it was missing a bunch of letters. About 5 years later, I bought a different font from a totally different source, and it had all the missing letters, and they were all hand cut. So you run into weird stuff like that when you're dealing with wood type. Now, again, this is one of those cases where the printer bought a bunch of this type, probably paid a lot of money for it, wanted to use it a lot, but they kept running out of letters, and so they just kept cutting new letters as they needed them. And so you get stuff like that, a D on the back of the B. So all of these cabinets I have filled with these notes so that when I run into the same problem, see, there's an R on the back of the original K. When I run into that problem of missing a letter, this sort of cheat note helps me figure out where there are some hidden extras. Sorry, I'm ignoring my other job here, letting the dogs in and out. All right, so here's some lead type. This is one of my favorite fonts, Latin Antique. It's called Latin because it has little triangular serifs. And I don't know why they stuck antique on there, but I guess there's a hint of a tiny bit of slab serif going on. I don't know. I recently discovered this out in Indiana, recently, probably 3 years ago. The son of an old friend of mine had it. And it's one of my favorite fonts. And previously, I'd only had it in 8 point and 30 point. And so now I have it in 45. And here's a bunch of type that I need to put away. This type, the type foundries used to steal each other's designs constantly. And This is a face that looks fairly common. It's kind of a circusy kind of vibe, but it originates in France. And this version of it is actually the original French cutting. And how I know that is because it doesn't have a pin mark. You see, there's no manufacturer's mark on the side, but the French cut their type at a higher height. Type high in France is taller than type high everywhere else, basically. Type high is 0.918 inches. But in France, they had their own type height. And when they sold type internationally, they would ground down the bottom. And you can see that's been ground down. And then they've also additionally ground a groove in the bottom. All foundry type has a groove like that. So that's the original French cutting. These are two fonts that date to the 1850s, lead type castings. And they do have, I believe they have a pin mark on them. The pin mark is this little circular mark on the side. And they engrave the name of the type foundry on there. And I have a bunch of reference materials that shows what pin mark was used by a certain foundry after which date, so you can accurately date stuff. And also type foundries would go out of business and they'd sell their mats and their machines to other foundries who would use them with the old pin marks. So it's not 100% accurate. So here's some other old type ancient sans serifs. Sans serifs, people think of as very modern, but they actually date to 1830 and possibly earlier. I think Caslon made a sans serif in 1816, and it sort of languished for a while. And then in 1830, they became really popular. There's a black letter, old slab serif, very old sans serif. Here we have nice Clarendon lead type, 48 point. And there's another version of it. This is a variation on Clarendon that's absolutely identical in every way to every other Clarendon, with the exception of the center stroke of the E. It has no serif. And when they do that to it, they call it a Doric for some odd reason. All right, I think I've bored you enough with type. Oh wait, I found a whole bunch of wood type. There's more to bore you with. Look at that. More William Page. He did the same thing with sans serifs that he did with the antiques and you know, other fonts, which is he created super triple extra condensed versions, and they're beautiful. I mean, they're perfect. The guy really knew how to draw type. Again, tons of really tiny type. I had an intern in here that pulled this case out and pulled it out too far and dropped it on the floor. And I had to put it all back together. And this is Hamilton type, and this is one of the few designs that Hamilton actually originated. It's basically a variation on the triple extra condensed sans serif, but it's an actual Hamilton design. Hamilton did not do much in the way of type designing. This font here is a very early 1830s decorated sans serif, meaning it has a drop shadow, an outline and a drop shadow. And it has been probably printed, again, millions of times. It has incredibly fine lines, and yet it's mostly intact. There's a few letters that have little bits out of them, but otherwise it's intact. So it just gives you some idea how tough this stuff is, that you can pound, you know, thousands of copies out on a printing press and still have fine lines like that survive. A couple of lazy dogs in the way. One more thing and then I can go upstairs. This is some of the large wood type let's see here. Let's find an interesting letter. This is Hamilton. This is Hamilton, manufactured in 1891. You can tell that from the manufacturer's mark on the cap A, which I'm not seeing right now, but it's there. And then there are fonts like, sorry, I did say I cleaned up, but I guess I didn't. Fonts like that, again, that's a Hamilton cutting. This came out of a storage locker in Chicago. It was all in milk crates and it was sitting on a concrete floor. It was all soaking wet. So I had to dry all this out. It was all curved, but it flattened out and it prints just fine. Another Hamilton, sans serif. This stuff is actually page, and it mates perfectly with that triple extra extended antique I showed you earlier. It's the exact same size, basically the exact same letter form and weight of the strokes, but with no serifs. And another large font. You can see the router marks on there. That's how they routed that out. There would be almost no hand cutting involved in a letter like that. And then I'll leave that there. This is an English font that is metallic sans serif. Very nice type. Hardly ever use it. I don't know if I've ever used it. All right, let's go upstairs. This is the studio where I do all the illustration and prop work. And you can see I've got a bunch of decorative junk everywhere. These are prop packages that I made for a movie. It hasn't been released yet. Set roughly in the 1870s. So I designed and manufactured these boxes and these containers for hand salve. That's a porcelain container, a dye container. Working on props, I have to have a lot of stuff on hand, and one of the things I like to keep on hand is a lot of jars, old jars that I can repurpose with new labels for, you know, a quick turnaround package. Oh, I just want to show you one other thing downstairs before I go up. This is a poster for that same show. So that is, you know, a period correct wood type poster. Now, because all the type cases are situated right near the press, I can put something together like this very quickly. I mean, you could design this in, you know, digitally, but I can put something like this together in, you know, 15 minutes and ink up the press and print 100 copies. And it's period accurate. And all of the spacing material, this is what's called reglet. It's what you use for letting between the lines when you're using wood type. And the letterpress people will recognize this. This is what's called furniture. Wood type furniture, the old printers like, I should say wood furniture. The old printers preferred wood furniture because it gives you more of what they called squash. So you could lock up a whole bunch of stuff on the bed of the press, use wood furniture, and then these clamps hold it in. And you could clamp it down and the wood would sort of squash against the type, as opposed to this metal furniture, which, you know, has no give to it. All right, so this is actually a good example of designing on the bed of the press and some of the changes that you have to make in order to fit stuff. When you're working with wood type, you can't size a font up and down. You might find the perfect font and it just doesn't fit. So what do you do? Well, one thing you can do, and what I attempted to do here, is swap out. This originally started out as all caps. So I changed it to lowercase and cap mixture to try to get it to fit, because lowercase takes up less space in the line. And that didn't work. So by putting it on a curve, I was able to make the line fit. And then it reflected that curve up there. I chose this font because it was open and it didn't block the illustration out. And then another thing is, this type was just perfect. But the problem with this one is, when I made it the proper line length, there was such wide spaces between the letters that the letter spacing was wider than the line spacing. So what I did was I double printed it in green, and then I moved it over, printed it in blue. It gives it a decorative drop shadow, but the real reason I did it is to fill in that letter spacing. All right, I promised you I'd go upstairs. I'm finally going upstairs. I have another couple of curiosities to show you. This is Korean wood type. Now, the Koreans changed their alphabet right around the time of Gutenberg. So this wood type appears to predate Gutenberg. If you go to the British Library website and look up Gutenberg, it says Gutenberg invented printing in 1450. In fact, they've been printing in Asia 500 years earlier. They actually had movable type, and the technology spread along the Silk Road. They were printing in Persia, in North Africa, long before Gutenberg. The interesting thing about this type is, you can see it's not all the same height. What they would do is, they would arrange the letters, and then they would actually pour a thin layer of wax into a tray. They would arrange the letters how they wanted to. Then they would warm the tray up, the wax would soften, and they'd press down at the top, and all of the type would level out. And then it was printable. This is another odd thing. This is from the 40s or 50s. And it was a time when you could actually get the New York Public Library to set lines of decorative Victorian type for you. So you could call the New York Public Library. If you had this poster, you could call them and say, you know, I want these words set in number 170. And the New York Public Library would set the words, proof them, and send you the proofs. I don't think they do that anymore.
Ross, I'm afraid we're going to have to cut you short a little bit because we've only got 4 minutes left
Oh my God.
to our meeting. So just quickly, I wanted to get to a few of the questions, at least, that we received. One was, how did you start your collection of type? Where did you find it?
I used to be a letterpress printer. I started off as a printer when I was a teenager and got out of that into illustration. And then in the mid 90s, I wanted to get back into, you know, having a little bit of type and a small press. So I contacted a lot of the used printing equipment dealers that I had worked with before back in the 70s and early 80s, and got some equipment from them. And then there used to be a newspaper called The Printer, and it had classified ads. So the printer was subscribed to by letterpress printers all over North America. And if somebody had something for sale, they would run a classified ad, usually with a phone number. Sometimes you'd have to write to people. But, you know, I was at that time in the early 90s calling people all over America, really, trying to convince these guys to ship type to me. And if not, I'd have to drive to wherever and pick it up. And often they'd say, oh, we only have 1 or 2 fonts. And you'd get there and there'd be 50 fonts, or they would have dumped a bunch of stuff in a 50-gallon barrel and you'd have to dig it out and sort it out. So it was a lot of hard work, but you know, I made a lot of good connections through all of that.
Wow. All right. Someone is asking if you have a particular favorite from your collection.
I love that outline antique that I showed you that was hand cut. I tend to use that one a lot. I always want to use the fat faces, but somehow or other they never work. I love them and try to use them all the time, but I don't know what it is. Sometimes they just don't have the right feel or whatever. But the antiques are my favorite.
Okay. Someone is asking, did printers have control of what fonts were created? Which I assume means, you know, how did particular fonts get made by particular foundries? How did they make those choices?
Yeah, I mean, printers would, the foundries would definitely get feedback from the printers. I mean, one of the ways they'd get feedback is certain designs would sell better than others, but there definitely was a lot of contact between the printers and the foundries in terms of the designs. Certain printers would value stuff that was more sturdy, could take a lot of abuse. Other printers wanted stuff that was more decorative. There was a lot of custom work being done. So as a printer, you could say, I love this antique, but do you have a version of it that has, you know, flowers carved into all the letters, or you know, different things like that. So the foundries would make special decorated versions of typefaces, and sometimes entirely new typefaces as custom orders for printers.
Cool. And well, now we're getting a question that says, "What do you have upstairs? Books or books of type specimens?" So,
I do. You want to see those?
Well, now we're actually running over. I believe that we didn't explain really that a big part of your work is doing these period recreations of period ephemera for movies, and I believe you were about to show us some of that.
Yeah.
Maybe we take just a minute or two to try and do a quick overview, and then I think we're going to have to wind up after that.
Okay.
And maybe come back another time if
Sure.
you're in favor of that.
Yeah, my mistake was I left my watch off, so I had no idea. And I could have stayed downstairs and talked about type for another 5
and
hours.
I was a bad host because I just kind of thought, forget it, he's rolling. We'll just keep going. And you know, and you're showing all this beautiful type, so I wanted to see all of it, and I was being selfish.
Okay, well, let me show you a quick overview of the upstairs.
Okay.
So this is the prop making section. And there are a bunch of props. There's the Book of Secrets from National Treasure Book of Secrets, and there's the Booth Diary. There's some stuff from Hateful Eight, Red Apple tins and the counter display. There's a whole bunch of stuff from Plot Against America. And then up here, I have a lot of stuff that, like for instance, old binders, old heavy duty binders up there. I have old ledgers and things. So these help as models, but also I can use them. I can fill those old binders with custom pages for a prop. And then I have a lot of stuff for making props, like old typewriters, lots of old typewriters. This is a device that perforates numbers into paper. There's a check writing machine. So stuff like that. It's mostly what I'm making are paper props. So I need to have a lot of stuff in terms of reference, but also stuff that I can repurpose, you know, maybe an old photo album or an old ledger that I can add new pages to. And you can see there's a lot of old prop stuff too. There's old police billy clubs. Yeah. Swords, bayonets, and different kinds of prop stuff. And then this is where I do my illustration and a lot of hand lettering and design work. There's the obligatory computer, and I also do a lot of printing with inkjet and laser printers for props as well. And I'll just show you really quickly. These are I was working on a show called The Gilded Age, which is written by Julian Fellows, the guy who did Downton Abbey. It's set in 1880s New York. So these are safety matchboxes that I designed. So I did original artwork, hand lettering, you know, came up with the idea for the designs. And these are not what they would call hero. In other words, we're not going to see a shot like that of this. At the very most, we'll see an actor, you know, pull out a match, light it, and that'll be that. But it just shows you the depth of detail that they go into on a show nowadays. It's much more important, graphic design is in film and television than it used to be. 20 years ago, they didn't care about it. And you can tell when you look at old movies, if you see graphic props, they're usually pretty terribly designed. You know, we've all seen the magazine with the inch wide gap between the columns of type. And, you know, they look like they were designed by somebody who's never actually seen a magazine before. So yeah, that's kind of what goes on up here. And yes, I have a ton of old type specimen books because getting the type correct to the period is a big part of the job. You have to know if you're using a font that was designed, you know, for the time. This is the 1906 American Type Founders specimen book, and this is the one that was in the Tiffany Design Studio. It's stamped Tiffany inside. So these type specimen books were handed out for free. There's usually a label inside that says it's actually the property of American Type Founders or whatever, and they just sort of lending it to you, but of course they never called them back. And every designer would have one of these, and every print shop, every type founder, everybody, they were just everywhere, and they were all copying and reusing each other's faces all the time. There's the 1882 Bruce, some very early 19th century type specimen books. Miller and Richard was an English foundry. McKellar Smith and Jordan, which was a descendant of the earliest type founder in America, the Johnson Type Foundry. Cleveland Type Foundry. I'm sorry, Cincinnati Type Foundry. This is one of the oldest specimen books I have. And various other Keystone, which started out as an ad agency and then became a type foundry. Hanson, Linotype, Ludlow, you know, you got to have them all for reference. Wow. Yeah. So that's that. I'm sorry I wasn't able to give you more of an idea of the upstairs, but hopefully that'll hold you and we can do more some other time.
Oh, I think that would be wonderful. If we could do a part 2, that would be fabulous.
Yeah.
And we have several, under the Q&A, several people saying things like,
Sure.
Lovely work. Thank you so much for sharing everything that you've shown to us.
Thank you.
Yeah, it is. It's very beautiful stuff. Okay, I believe we're gonna leave it there then. Thank you so much for taking us in, and we'll hope to see you soon.
Okay, thank you so much for hosting me. Thanks.
Thanks, Ross.
All right. All right. Goodbye, everybody. Thank you.
Thank
Thank you for coming.